here at CPW. Thank you for joining us today for the conversation Chronic Lyme, Disability Advocacy, and the Role of Art in Managing, Understanding, and Living with Illness with Holly Ahern, Jessica D. Breyer, Jiatong Lu, and Mary Beth Pfeiffer. This is the second event in our conversation series, which hosts discussions that dig deeper into the exhibitions on view in CPW's galleries. We inaugurated the series last fall with a dialogue between the scholar and curator Nicole R. Fleetwood and the artist Raheem Fortune. And we hope you're able to join us for the next two events in the series. Really quickly, a plug for the next two, which are already planned. First, we have Seeing Otherwise, Black Womanhood and the Matrilineal Archive with Leslie Deschler-Kenosi, Zoraida Lopez-Diago, Kiana Mestrich, and Shannon Anita, who is sister of the late artist Nona Faustine, who shows in the back gallery, and the director of her archive. That will be from 3 to 5 on Sunday, March 15th. This is all on our website. And then on Saturday, April 18th, also starting at 3, An Millet, photographer and professor of photography at Bard College, will be in conversation with poet, writer, and artist Ocean Vuong, whose first solo exhibition, Song, we are surrounded by right now. And if you haven't seen the exhibitions on view, Ocean Vuong Song, Kiana Mestrich, Do Not Fold, Spindle, or Mutilate, Jiatong Lu, Nowhere Land, and Nona Faustine, What My Mother Gave Me, please come back before they close on May 10th and spend some time with them. They are all really beautiful and powerful exhibitions. We're really proud of them, and we're honored to have them here. Today's conversation, pivoting back, is held in conjunction with the current exhibition in our community gallery, Jiatong Lu, Nowhere Land. Nowhere Land is a long-term project focusing on the chronic Lyme disease community across the United States. And Lu started the project after her own neurological Lyme diagnosis several years ago. So her work, which you'll see in the community gallery, she was the winner of our summer, our annual portfolio review prize. So we have a portfolio review every summer. We invite colleagues across the field to come and do these reviews. And then at the end, one portfolio is chosen as the winner, and that artist gets an exhibition in the community gallery. And Jiatong was the winner of last year's. So her work, which includes text, photographs, and archival documents, reveals the profound physical, psychological, and financial toll of Lyme disease, which is often overlooked, denied, unseen. So you'll hear much more about it when everybody digs in later. But just a quick intro of our moderator, and then Jessica will come up and take it from there. So the conversation is moderated by Jessica D. Breyer. We're very, very lucky to have her here. Breyer is a brilliant scholar and curator, and she is the curator of photography now at the Loeb, which is the museum at Vassar College. And her first book, Typophoto, New Typography and the Reinvention of Photography, was published in 2025 by University of Minnesota Press. So join me in welcoming Jessica up to the front, and she'll take it on from here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I feel very privileged to get to welcome you to CPW, which is one of my favorite places, even though I'm not a CPW employee, just a fan. But it feels really fitting to have this conversation here because, of course, Jiatong Lu is a brilliant artist and someone whose work I really admire. Obviously, many of you are here because you're interested in photography. That's really why CPW exists, for people who are interested in photography and for photographers themselves. But I also really think of this place as a community space and a place where larger concerns, issues, and conversations happen. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today. I think the topic, whether chronic Lyme has touched your life or not, this topic of disability advocacy, chronic illness, the failures of the system to treat or recognize individual experiences. This is something that all of us, that has touched all of our lives, I think, that we can all relate to. And so I think it's very fitting to have that conversation today. And of course, to talk about the role of art in that experience in kind of navigating all of those things. So without further ado, our plan for today is for each of our panelists to give a brief introduction to what they do. We have a really, truly interdisciplinary group of people here. We'll start with the artist Jiatong Lu, talking about her work. As Marina said, her exhibition is on view behind us, or behind me, in the community gallery. So each of the panelists will come up, give a brief introduction, and then we will have a conversation and invite you all to be part of that as well. And I believe at the end, we'll leave a little bit of time for Jiatong to give a walkthrough informally if anyone wants to stick around. We won't go the full 2 hours, I promise. We'll leave a little time, and anyone who wants to walk through the show with the artist is very welcome to stay. Okay, so introductions. And I'll introduce all three, and then they'll come up in turn. Jiatong Lu is a visual artist working with photography, video, and archives. Born and raised in Northwest China and currently based in New York, she holds an MFA in photography, video, and related media from the School of Visual Arts. Her work centers on people living outside dominant narratives. Moving between individual experience and public history, her practice examines how personal and collective trauma, systemic forces, and social inequity shape human life. Her current project, Nowhere Land, on view here, focuses on chronic Lyme disease and its community in the United States. It's been featured in Time magazine. Her work has been exhibited internationally, and her awards include the Award of Excellence from the 2025 Alexia Vision Grant, the 2024 JGS Fellowship for Photography from NIFA. She was the winner of the 2024 Lens Culture Art Photography Award and the 2019 NIFA Artist Fellowship in Photography. Our second speaker will be Mary Beth Pfeiffer. She is the author of Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change, and has been an award-winning investigative journalist for 3 decades. A reporter who specialized in social justice, environmental, and health issues. Since 2012, Pfeiffer has become the leading U.S. investigative journalist on the growth of and controversies surrounding Lyme disease, a hidden menace that, she argues, has been fostered by a warming world while being vastly underestimated and poorly managed by American medicine. For her Lyme reporting, Pfeiffer was honored with a half-dozen awards, including the prestigious Sigma Delta Chi Award for 2013 from the Society of Professional Journalists, one of 2 of her Sigma Delta Chi Awards. And finally, we'll hear from Holly Ahern, a microbiologist and nationally recognized expert in Lyme and tick-borne diseases, with over 3 decades of experience in microbiology education and clinical diagnostics. As a scientist and Lyme disease patient advocate, Holly has served on state and federal government committees, including the New York State Lyme and Tick-Borne Disease Working Group and the HHS Tick-Borne Disease Working Group. She currently serves as Chief Scientific Officer at ACES Diagnostics, where she leads scientific strategy, publication development, and external engagement to support LymeSeq, the company's flagship diagnostic test for Lyme disease. So, without further ado, our panelists.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jiatong Lu. I'm a photographer and visual artist based in Poughkeepsie, New York. My current, do you want like place the light a little bit down? Sorry. My current project, Nowhere Land, focuses on the chronic Lyme disease community in the United States. This project comes from my own diagnosis of neurological Lyme disease in 2021. At my worst, I was bedridden for almost a year. It was a very terrifying time. When the CDC recommended treatment didn't work for me, I started my own research online for alternative therapy, where I found a huge chronic Lyme disease community. In the Lyme community, they talk about the unreliable testing, the outdated CDC guidelines, and also the dismissal and neglect from the doctors. Also the chronic nature of the disease. Their experiences closely reflected what I was going through myself. Also, I realized outside the chronic Lyme disease community, the public had very little understanding of the severity and the complexity of this disease. So I decided to interview patients and document their struggles to raise awareness. I hope through my project, fewer people will go through what we have been through. In the first 2 years of this project, I focused on building trust within the community and also documenting portraits and their daily lives. At the same time, I was collecting medical records, personal journals, emails, and text messages, and also social media posts from the patients. Rather than presenting a single narrative, I would like to describe the reality of the people living chronic Lyme disease in a more systemic and overwhelming way, reflecting everyday life they face. The reality actually not only shaped by the illness itself, but also shaped by medical stigma, social conditions, emotional stress, and also financial hardship. In this part of the installation, I photographed mothers and their children who all are living with this disease. Once I received an email from a mother filled with anger and grief, and she said, "I am a Lyme patient and a mother of 2 children who also have Lyme disease. I have met many other mothers like me, women who were sick themselves and unknowingly passed Lyme to their children because no one warned us." Stories like hers have always strengthened my commitment, raising awareness of congenital Lyme disease. At the very least, I believe women deserve to know this possibility exists so they can make informed decisions. I also want to highlight how Lyme disease and its chronic progression affect women's lives. Research dedicates women are more likely than men develop chronic related immune conditions. However, in our medical systems, women's symptoms have been always dismissed as maybe stress, hormonal imbalance, or other psychological issues. And these kinds of explanation have been used historically to pathologize women's experiences. Because of climate change, now ticks are living longer and spreading further, and also the infection rates are rising. So I expanded my work to include an ecological perspective. Just think about this. Just this very small, very tiny organism has revealed a much larger vulnerability in how we respond to health crises. So I believe tick-borne illness is not only a medical issue, it's also a social, environmental, and a systemic one. Last year, I went to the Lyme, Connecticut, where the Lyme disease first officially recognized in 1976. I also went to the library in Lyme and did research on polymerase papers. Polly was an artist. She was one of the first patients. She documented her family members' unexplained symptoms, while the doctors dismissed them as stress and psychological issues. She also noticed her neighbors also had the similar symptoms, so she began recording all those cases and also advocating for recognition. Her effort actually contributed to the identification of Lyme disease. In a letter she wrote in 1981 to the New England Journal of Medicine, and she said, "Could it be that it's not a hypochondriacal patient, but a doctor who chooses not to confront the unknown?" Nearly 50 years later, Lyme patients are still facing the same dismissal and stigma. I really hope the viewers can understand this project is not only about Lyme disease. It asks a larger question. What happens when our medical system encounters something it cannot fully explain? Lyme disease just becomes a lens through which we can see how our medical system protects certainty and authority rather than providing spaces for uncertainty or even for the patients themselves. Thank you so much.
It's good to be here to talk about a very important subject. And the theme of this gathering made me remember that I actually did use some legitimate art, piece of art, in an article that I wrote fairly recently about a young man who suffered for many years with Lyme disease. It went to his brain. It caused serious mental illness problems. And he ended up killing his best friend and then taking his own life. And the doctor who informed me about that particular case sent me this piece of art from another case he had had of a chronic Lyme patient who also committed suicide. And I think the picture just speaks volumes in terms of somebody's head is on fire. They're breathing fire. They're in a desert. There's pain in that picture, and that's what this is about, and that's what we'll talk about some more. So I'm just going to take you through my journey as a journalist, because I came to Lyme disease not as the parent of someone who had had chronic Lyme, not as someone who had chronic Lyme herself, but as someone who needed very much to be educated about Lyme disease, because I came into it as an investigative reporter for 30 years. It was one of the last series of articles that I did, and the kinds of things I do. I talk about injustice and waste of government money, and I even managed to get one or two people arrested and fired along the way because of the way they behaved in their official capacity. So it was, to my great surprise, to find this in Lyme disease. And this is sort of the bookends of my career, starting in 1982 and ending in 2015 at the Poughkeepsie Journal. So this was part of my awakening to Lyme disease. Here I thought I was going to write a story about a rising problem, that lots of people were getting infected, but I had thought it was more or less under control, that the stories I'd heard, the horror stories, were just the aberration. That was not what I learned. They were classic and typical of a failed system that didn't meet the needs of Lyme patients and in fact denied those needs. So what I found is the officials, they're not talking about ticks, they're not talking about we got to save children who are missing years of schooling. What are they concerned about? People are being given too much antibiotics that are given out routinely in medicine and to too large a degree. And they were going after the doctors who were trying to help Lyme patients. So then I move on to how do we test if somebody has Lyme disease? And I found, to my great dismay, I guess we all knew that the Lyme test didn't work, but it was such a truism that, I don't know, I didn't really think much of it. But there are huge repercussions to that failure. And the failure was upheld by the powers that be, the CDC in particular. They admitted the tests don't work. They dismissed the problem as sooner or later you'll test positive, so don't worry about it. So therefore they perpetuated the problem. And, you know, the way that they dismissed it, 10 to 20% of people will stay ill after they are treated for Lyme disease. That's not an approach to a serious health problem. And basically they said that's acceptable. So this is what happens, and this is what happened in 2015 because of a failed Lyme test. And this is a 17-year-old boy. He was a junior in high school, came home from summer camp, had been bitten by a tick, had been tested twice, told that he didn't have Lyme disease. The test was falsely negative, and he collapsed on his front lawn and he died of Lyme carditis. And at the time, they said there were only 4 Lyme carditis cases in the entire recorded medical history. 5 months later, also in Dutchess County, across the river, it happens again to a 38-year-old father of 3. So not so rare. On the upside, we'll talk a little bit about some of the progress that has been made. We're spending more money on Lyme disease. The medical literature is documenting that the Lyme spirochete survives in the human body after antibiotics. It's been found in autopsy tissues, et cetera. But even though we've made some progress, there are still many, many problems. And this is from surveys that are done of chronic Lyme disease patients. Why did your Lyme disease get to an out of control phase? Well, because the doctor who treated me, or 86% of those people said, didn't really understand tick-borne disease. My test was falsely negative, 61%. And how long do you have to go to get treated for Lyme disease? 32% went 100 or more miles. So the denial goes on. This is an article that appeared recently in the Canadian Broadcasting Company system. And basically they're saying that these performers, very well known, who are saying they have Lyme disease are part of the problem. They don't really have Lyme disease, but they're making other people think that they might have Lyme disease. So that was presented in an article by Dr. Richard Horowitz, who some of you may know as a Lyme disease practitioner. You can get medically assisted dying easier than you can get treated for chronic Lyme disease. True 10 years ago, 20 years ago, still true. So I'll close with this. I wrote an article this summer about a very popular park in Bridgeport, Connecticut, that they actually had to close for the entire season because the tick infestation was so bad. This is my book. I have 4 copies that I will give away to whoever rushes up to the desk first. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here talking about this. I don't know why I'm happy about talking about this, but that's what I do. I'm an educator for a long time. I'm a microbiology educator, and I can tell you that until 2009, the story I was telling my students about Lyme disease was basically what the CDC said, that it's hard to catch, easy to cure, not very common. only rare. And then events occurred that sort of changed my perspective on that considerably, and that was basically that my daughter developed a mysterious illness. And so I just want to kind of go through that journey, because having talked at this point with thousands of people, this is a common journey. So this is how it unrolled for my family, and maybe it will resonate with some of you. So this is my daughter, who I hope she's not watching, because she'll probably be very, I don't know, unnerved that I'm showing all these pictures of her, but nonetheless. So before Lyme was, which began for us in 2009, she was a vibrant, healthy, independent, having a great time. She was a swimmer, an athlete. In college, she broke records. She became an All-American athlete, and literally just a very short window after she made All-American as a swimmer, she called to say, "I'm not feeling well. Do you think it would be all right if I came home for the weekend?" And so, of course, so you go get her, bring her home. She went to bed. She did not get up again for the next 6 months. So at that point, what do? You go to the doctor, and that's where we can pick up here. So, and I will tell you, previous to that moment, she had been bitten by a tick. We found the tick. We brought the tick and the child to the doctor. There was a rash, but it wasn't really the right kind of rash. So the medical advice we got was wait and watch. If it develops into a bullseye, or if there are other symptoms, then then we'll worry about this more and treat it as if it were Lyme disease. So from there, about several months later, she did start to develop symptoms. They were very nonspecific. Go back to the doctor. What does the doctor do? Blood tests, many, many blood tests. And after many blood tests, she said, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing that we can detect. Don't know what it is. It's probably just a virus. So then more months go by, and that event unfolded where she's in bed, unable to get out, and then we call in the medical specialist. So at that point, we went to see, you name it, specialist, and we went to see that specialist. And she had CAT scans, more tests, more blood tests. She had CAT scans, she had MRI, she had very expensive medical procedures that our insurance company gladly paid for, and that's an important point. And at the end of the day, the answer was, well, we don't really know what's wrong with your daughter. Is she a high maintenance person? Do you think she's seeking attention? Do you think there's something wrong? Yeah, I mean, she's a girl after all. And I'm not kidding you. One of the providers told me that. And so at that point, that was sort of the beginning of a very long journey. But I will tell you that the reason why we determined that she had Lyme disease was because a friend who had gone through this same thing said, have you looked at Lyme disease? And no. So let's go back to the doctor. We had the Lyme disease blood test, and thank God it came back positive for her, which means she'd had it for a long time. And then I started to look at those symptoms, and it was clear that that really was what we were dealing with at that point. So that sort of began once we had a diagnosis, that became a long journey. I'm not going to bore you with the details because we could be here for all day if you wanted to. But we used to rate how she was doing on a percentage scale. So, at the beginning, she was about 20% Kaylee, right? She was very, very ill. All the concerns that everybody else has mentioned were all there. And so we, at that point, found medical providers that were specialists in Lyme disease. Down here, we had to drive, from Saratoga, New York, down here to see physicians, got very good advice. She was treated with long-term antibiotics, high-dose long-term antibiotics for a while. That returned her to about 70%. And in that window of time between the two, I started to do a lot of advocacy and other things. So that's why you see her punching a tick, in case you're wondering, okay? So then, again, at that point, the antibiotics had brought her back, but, there's still farther to go. The antibiotics also made her very ill. So at that point, we moved to other approaches. And again, she increased to 85%, because I don't like to end this story with, because people always ask me, well, what is she doing now? And the answer is she's about 99%. She's doing very well. She's pretty much returned to her normal self. Not that she doesn't have glitches, but she's more or less returned to herself. And I want to tell you that it was a long journey, but it can happen and it will happen. You just have to find the right thing, or a few things as the case may be. So one of the first things I did as a microbiologist and mother, of course, was, doesn't everybody do this? Your kid is sick. The doctors tell you they don't know what's wrong with it. Oh, it's Lyme disease, but we're not going to do anything about that. Doesn't everybody hit the scientific literature to go back and find out what is going on with their children? So I did a deep dive into this topic. And by deep, I mean, I know more. If you ask me anything, I can cite the literature, give you the citation for that. That's how long it took. But one of the first things that popped out at me was that the peer-reviewed published literature, especially from the medical side, from infectious disease doctors, was full of this is the name of my book, by the way. When I get around to writing it, Mary Beth is going to help me. Bad science equals bad medicine. So this article, one of the first ones I noticed, New England Journal of Medicine, highly prestigious, 2001. Once it was published, New York Times came out and said, guess what? Good news. We have Lyme disease. Hardly anybody gets Lyme disease, and you can treat it with 2 antibiotic pills of doxycycline. And nobody has to worry about this anymore. You take the 2 pills of doxy, you don't get Lyme disease. The world is wonderful. And actually there is a quote within that paper, well, not the paper, but within the New York Times report that basically says, Lyme disease, it's great, this is great news. Lyme disease is hard to catch and easy to cure. So when you unravel that paper, it's full of biases. And by bad science, I mean, they did this research to prove their own point, which was that you shouldn't be taking long-term antibiotics for this disease. They did it to prove their own point as opposed to the way science is supposed to be done. So that was number one. I found a whole bunch more of those. In fact, I wrote what I referred to as my manifesto, and I have submitted it to Congress if anybody wants to go read it, because it is a 40-page document that details all the bad science that led up to where we are today and remain today. That being said, this was released last year, 2023, and one of the authors on this is the lead of the Lyme disease research initiative at NIH. And when you read that, they did a systematic review of pediatric Lyme disease patients from first diagnosis onward, and that's the paper. And then immediately there's a press release which got picked up, and you could go read the press release. But the press release says this, right? So majority reported their kids recovered within 6 months. 102 kids, notably small percentage of children took longer than 6 months to recover. Now I'm going to ask you, if you had to say what a notably small percentage would be, what percentage would you call notably small? 2%? 2%? Less than 5%? 22%. That's what's detailed in this paper. When you read the paper, when you read the whole manuscript, but let's be honest, who reads the whole manuscript? When you read the press release and you look at it's good news and you realize they think 22% of children ending up with long-term chronic illness is a notably small percentage. It's good news. That blew my mind. And the fact that the distance between these two papers is 20-something years blows my mind. It still blows my mind, which is why I'm still doing this and why I'm up here talking about this right now and why I'm this, okay? So microbiologist, so I know bacteria, I understand the science, I have done research, I've done clinical laboratory work. I'm a mom, so this is passion for me because this was unfair, what happened to my daughter, what's happened to so many other people. And mad, I'll let you, so I was really angry and passionate about it, but perhaps I was a little bit insane as well because of all that, of the issues. So I'll let you interpret that however you want. But the mission was, we need to fix this. This is a huge medical problem. It needs to be fixed. It's so unfair. It's not a small problem at all. I mean, it's a worldwide issue, and that is acknowledged to this day. So at that point, that is when I started speaking. So that's when I I call it yelling. So in other words, any educational event, I would go and I would talk about Lyme disease. I scheduled several on my own. I wrote all kinds of op-eds. That one actually was in the Poughkeepsie Journal. And I'll tell you where that all came from in a second. I served on peer review panels so that we could actually be performing good research, that would lead to results that would change the dogma that we have around Lyme disease. So again, to New York State Senate, that's me talking to the New York State Senate. This is me talking to former Congressman, former Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado to say this is, and you know what? They all said, yes, we know it's a really big problem. Okay, that's wonderful. So what are we going to do about it? And some things did come from that. In fact, one of the earliest legislations that I worked very, very hard on was something that on the advocacy side we call the Doctor Protection Bill, because as Mary Beth pointed out, at one point, pretty much all the Lyme disease doctors who saw Lyme disease patients who weren't afraid to do that, who weren't afraid to step up and do the right thing and try to actually cure their patients, were under review from the medical boards for that very reason. So because they were treating Lyme disease patients, that was the only reason. So we were able to successfully work a law through the process that then Governor Cuomo signed that protected doctors treating Lyme disease patients from pernicious and useless review by the medical boards. So that law is still standing, and I hope it's protected more people, giving more doctors the confidence that they actually can perhaps buck the system a little bit and treat Lyme disease patients. During this whole period, I organized a conference that then Congressman Chris Gibson was actually the sponsor for. It was at Skidmore College. That got a lot of attention and press, as you might expect. And then in fact, that was where I met Mary Beth Pfeiffer. She had read about that. She reached because she was doing her story about No Small Things. And she called and said, I'm writing this article. Would you like to talk? And I said, yes. And then I ended up talking her ear off for like 2 hours, like I'm doing with you right now. Okay. But at the end of the day, that No Small Thing series was an amazing change. It truly was. The other thing that happened was a journalist that was with the New Yorker magazine, Michael Spector, also reached out because he had written an article about Lyme is no big deal, blah, blah, blah. He got his butt handed back to him by people who were reading his things and said, that's not true. And he started to do a deeper dive. And that was published also around that same time. And that was, I would say, the tipping point. That was the turning point when mainstream journalism started to stop reiterating what the infectious disease docs were telling everybody and doing the investigation and finding out, wait, that's not exactly right. And that was all around 2015 or so, along those lines. So one of the things that came out of that was the fact that diagnostic testing for Lyme disease is one of the biggest issues for so many reasons. My daughter's test thankfully came back positive, but it was because she'd been ill with the disease for a very long time. And this is a bacteria that gets into your body, goes off and hides and becomes very difficult at that point to diagnose because you're having weird non-specific symptoms and also very difficult to treat. So if you had a test that allowed for diagnosis, then that would allow for earlier antibiotic treatment. For example, my daughter would have got treatment. Probably I wouldn't be standing here today. So that was one of the things. To this day, they're still trying to defend two-tier serology as an excellent test for Lyme disease, when in fact it is a very poor test. Less than 30% accurate in early stage of the disease when it's most treatable, and only about 50% overall when so whatever you're hearing about the latest and greatest things, at the end of the day, it's highly variable because everybody's immune response to this infection is different. So you can't use the same standardized test because not everybody produces the same overall response to it, because that's how good these bacteria actually are. And so, over here, antibiotic therapy is good for early stage Lyme disease. That came from Johns Hopkins University, who did a prospective study starting at day 1 through the end. and showed that if they were diagnosed and treated early, most people recovered, and that it was the people who went undiagnosed and misdiagnosed that did not. And, at that point, we need early stage diagnostics. And the reality is there are no early stage diagnostics. They all are bad. And I will also just add a little caveat. The EM rash, the bullseye rash that everybody's supposed to get if you get Lyme disease is not correct either, right? So 10% of people get a really nice bullseye rash. And by the way, most of them are men that do. Women don't get a bullseye rash. Women get smaller rashes, or they don't get rashes at all. So we need a test for that. And that is where I have gone, in that direction. And that is why I worked with actually Tammy Crawford. Same story with her daughter. She actually came from Arizona to New York State to see a New York State physician to treat her daughter. We met through that physician. And once we met, it was like, we have to fix this. So she has fundraising and business background. I have scientific background. And so at the end of the day, we were able to develop a diagnostic test that we're currently taking through FDA clearance. That is accurate in early stage and remains accurate across all stages because it takes into account that huge immune response variability among different patients. And so that was probably too long, and that's all I'll say about me, but that's where the Lyme disease story is. And I'm sure it resonates with many of you because it's far too common a story. And the thing that blew my mind, by the way, Polly Murray's son still has symptoms of Lyme disease. Did you know that? Yeah. So he's an ER doc, and he still has weird symptoms that can be attributed to his infection with Lyme disease when he was a kid. That was a long time ago. We need to fix this. Thank you.
Speaking, you said the medical system protects certainty and authority. So the subtext there is that what's not protected is patience, uncertainty, the desperation that people are feeling as they're trying to get answers about what they're going through, right? And all three of you spoke about, this disease being denied, dismissed, people trying to pretend that it doesn't exist, right? And so each of you, as an artist, as a biologist and mother, as a journalist, right? Each of you has worked to make visible something that's very real. And so I wanted to start us off by thinking about kind of how this disease and this experience is and isn't represented, and the role of representation in trying to understand chronic Lyme. So Jiatong, you're an artist, so that's why I start with this question of representation, and no pressure to start, but you've all given us a few different representations. Holly, we looked at pictures of your daughter. I mean, this is very, very personal. We're looking at pictures of people who've contacted you, right, in the chronic Lyme community who are navigating this experience. So I wonder if each of you can comment on the importance of representation, the challenges of representation, how you have sought to represent this experience, this condition, and what representation is needed. Jiatong, do you want to start us off?
Okay. Yeah. I think this is a really, really important question, and I have been thought about this question during my whole process. Especially when I work with this very vulnerable community, my project reaches very personal and vulnerable places. To be honest, 4 years ago, when I just had the idea for this project, I didn't fully realize the ethical and emotional complication involved in this project. Once I speaking with patients and getting to know their stories more deeply, and also understanding the long history of stigma this community has experienced, I actually started seriously questioning myself how I should approach this project, how I should present their lives. So at that point, I decided not to use very traditional documentary or photojournalistic way to approach this project, even though I understand those kind of approaches may be the most visually efficient way to communicate suffering, illness, but somehow I really don't want to reduce the subject to their suffering, to their illness. So I began this project with portraits. Even though all of those stories are sad, sometimes even tragic, but I hope through portraiture, the subjects can somehow feel empowered. Also, I put lots of my own respect and empathy in those portraits. I hope the viewers also can feel it as well. For the challenging, I remember I definitely encountered some challenging during the process. I remember when I went to the portfolio review and show my work to the viewers, and I have received feedback like, these are very beautiful photos, but it's very hard to connect to Lyme disease community. At that time, I understood that response, so I continue deepening my research and expanding my project. But at the same time, I still hold on to my principle on how I should approach, how I should present their stories. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. I am proud and honored to have represented people with Lyme disease, particularly people with very serious, intractable Lyme disease. And I think part 10 of my long series on Lyme disease was based on a trove of documents that were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act from the CDC and NIH. And in one of them, which sort of just sums everything up, a doctor who was retiring or congratulating somebody else on retiring said that he wouldn't miss the Lyme loonies. He'll miss everything else about working for the government, but not the Lyme loonies. And this is the way that Lyme disease patients have been portrayed, have been made to appear as not really connected to what their problems are. The system isn't the problem, they're the problem. And as my series unfolded, this was somewhat early in the days of the internet when we counted clicks on articles. And we were finding that my articles were turning up all over the place, in Australia, in Europe, in every state in the US. And it said something. We were representing something out there. And, you know, I'm proud that as a journalist we can do that. But the other thing, the other issue I had to deal with as I was kind of peeling the onion on Lyme disease with each article, I would learn more and go to the next level, is that, where was I going with that? It's the denial, I suppose, is what I'm going for. Is that as a reporter, I could face that. I could represent people. I could confront that. And I could make a difference, you know? And I discovered Holly in that process, and she helped me. I discovered other people, one of whom is sitting right in the front row here, who is an esteemed, one of the best Lyme disease doctors in the country, if not the world, Dr. Kenneth Liegner. So I would just like to point him out. People helped me in representing the Lyme story. And I'll remember what that point was as we go along.
So one of the things that resonated with me for a long time was, you know, the more people you talk to, the more people understood. I mean, so many people understand that this is a big problem, and yet we're still stuck, or we seem to be. I mean, I think we truly are making progress in that. But one thing that truly resonated with me was in a conversation with then Congressman Antonio Delgado, when he said, after we described this to him and suggested, that was when we were trying to get legislation for the tick-borne disease working group to come through. He said, this sounds like institutionalized discrimination. And that's exactly what it is, with medicine as the institution, and actually with support from our federal government in the form of the NIH, not all of NIH, but the part of it that is focused on tick-borne diseases, and also on the part of medicine, in particular infectious disease medicine, that is more obsessed with antibiotics as opposed to, you know, we need to give these patients everything possible in order to help them improve their lives. So that word, you know, when I realized exactly what that referred to, that really sums up pretty much everything there is for Lyme disease patients that they have to deal with. There is institutionalized discrimination from them, and until we change the institution, that discrimination is probably going to stay.
I'm wondering, this is responding a little more than staying on our script, but obviously we've heard a lot about how patients themselves, especially women, are dismissed for their symptoms and called quote unquote crazy, or either outright or implied. And I wonder if people who do the work that you do, Holly and Mary Beth, if you also have been accused of this, of kind of, you know, you're a scientist, you're a journalist, does it extend beyond even just the people who are experiencing this themselves as patients? Because of course it's easy for a doctor to sit in a room with a patient and say, well, you don't know about this. You don't know anything. You're just a patient, right? Please.
I remembered the point I was going to
But you're both experts. So,
Okay.
So do you get accused of this as well?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But what I was getting to before is that I had to decide at some point what side I was on in this struggle. And as an investigative reporter, you do draw conclusions. You do make decisions on the weight of the evidence, on which side prevails. You look at the medical literature, you talk to many, in my case, patients, doctors, advocates. And the prevailing message that was out there, the message in the New York Times about it's easy to treat and no big deal, the message on the CDC website, 10 to 20%, no big deal. Even if they stay ill, they'll eventually get better. Or even if the tests fail, it'll eventually, tell you that you have Lyme disease. So anyway, I had to, at some point, say, is chronic Lyme real? And I came to the conclusion that it was. And I was very much stepped out of the mainstream of journalism at that point in my career. Not many reporters were saying that. And it was a little scary. I think that because of the validation of patients and sources and people who were really suffering, who read my articles and validated them and said, yes, you are onto something, that kept me going. But I have to say that since I did that work on Lyme disease, I have not returned to the mainstream of journalism.
Wow, that's very telling. Holly, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, yes, there has been significant pushback, and I have to say, I don't care, because I'm a mad microbiologist mom. So you hit me with whatever, particular bias thing you want to hit me with, and I come back with 40 papers. You want to talk about it? We'll talk about the science, and I'll show you where you are wrong. Now, how do you feel about it? That's how I deal with it. Some of the things that have gotten me in particular over time is the fact that the bacteria that cause Lyme disease can be transmitted from a pregnant mom to their fetus, causing all kinds of potential outcomes. I mean, besides the fetal death, stillbirth, abnormalities, that kind of thing, that's one thing. But the fact is, there's a whole unstudied, what happens to those kids that are born and end up with neurological issues and concerns, because a lot of them do. And there are now mom groups out there who are actually discussing this. And for everybody, that is a woman's issue. It truly is. So that part, starting in 1999, until 1999, it was acknowledged that these bacteria are transmitted transplacentally. In 2000, everything changed. And we could spend hours talking about why I think it all changed, but we won't do that because we'll be here forever. But the point being, that all got shoved off to the side. And what you mentioned in particular was that women need to know this. So they need to realize, just like with syphilis or other conditions that can be transmitted transplacentally, women should be made aware. Everybody should be made aware. There should be some kind of treatment for that. There should be what they do with syphilis, right? They will immediately treat the mom with IV penicillin, right? And usually the outcomes are significantly improved. Untreated mothers end up with 50% with fetal abnormalities. Treated, it goes down to like 10%. So this is something that needs to come to the forefront. And the good news on that is that in 2 years ago, there was a group convened to do a Banbury conference at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. It's a very prestigious scientific conference. I was part of that group. We all got together. We reviewed all of the information, and it took 2 years. However, we have compiled all the information on transplacental transmission and have written a peer-reviewed paper that has been submitted and is under review right now. So hopefully that will make it to out into the world shortly, and then that will be another tool that people could use to advocate for themselves to get that antibiotic treatment if they had to. So yeah, there's a lot of injustice there.
So Jiatong, you mentioned a few minutes ago the kind of difficulty of representing people's experiences through this particular trauma. And I wonder how you kind of balance thinking about trauma and healing in your work. I know that for a lot of people, they're living with chronic illness. Some of these symptoms get worse over time. They don't necessarily get better. And that's part of the reality of this condition. But I wonder if you've thought about, or if you're interested in ways of kind of thinking about healing and sort of balancing those aspects of people's experience, and maybe along with healing, like resilience, right? The sort of strength of dealing with a chronic illness, which I think is something that, whether you have chronic Lyme or know someone who does, I think we all have an experience of seeing someone battle a long-term illness, and it's an incredibly powerful thing to see how resilient people can be in spite of the reality of their symptoms. So I wonder if you think about that with the people that you've made your work with.
Yeah, through my work, I feel like trauma and since my work always talk about the theme related to trauma or suffering, those kind of things, but I also feel a very strong healing through the project, through the process, not only from my personal perspective, but also from the patient's perspective. For example, I have received feedback from patients who told me after seeing this exhibition, and they experienced a strong emotional release. So I think that's also kind of a form of healing. As Holly just mentioned before, based on my observation, I feel like people often avoid the heavy conversation, especially when the illness becomes chronic. Many of my subjects and many patients I have met, they prefer to hide their illness and suffering. They gradually stop talking about their illness anymore. Even don't talk to their close, like family members. The reason they do that, because not only because they don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable, but also because they want to protect themselves from being questioned and dismissed again. So I feel like through my work, especially through the exhibition format, is kind of create a space for healing. In the exhibition, the suppressed feelings and the emotions can be recognized without judgment. Just this, being seen, being heard, being recognized with judgment is deeply meaningful for chronic Lyme disease patient, for this community. Yeah.
I guess I would just add to that to your point, that's a great point, that they don't want to talk about their illness at a certain point, is because people get tired of hearing it. You hear of high disease rates among families with Lyme disease. They've also been denied care. They've been told it's not real. Their families often don't accept it. It's, that's just ramps up the pain of Lyme disease and living with it.
Right. There's a re-traumatization, I would think, in the continual denial and in being met with disbelief or just exhaustion. I don't want to hear about it anymore. Right. So of course people would want to just avoid that altogether, I would think. And it also feels like something particular to American culture, where we want we want things to be solvable and fixable, right? We want there to be a problem and it gets fixed, it gets addressed. Isn't that great? Check, and we're done, and we're going to move on now. And people are very uncomfortable with not being able to move on and with there not being an easy and obvious fix. And so I wonder, you all probably know the answer to this very obviously, but is chronic Lyme unique in the context of this country? I mean, is this this is an international problem, I would think, yes. But the way that it's being treated here, is this a specifically American problem, or nope? So it's just a coincidence that this maps so much onto our cultural tendencies, I guess.
Yeah, and I say that because the same belief system within established medicine is the same here as it is in Europe, as it is in Australia. And I say that because Australian patients are being told, well, we don't have the right ticks. Just because you have weird symptoms doesn't mean you have Lyme disease. Even if you test positive for Lyme disease, it doesn't mean you have Lyme disease because you live in Australia. And I know this because I gave testimony to the Australian Senate, because advocates in Australia are trying to do the same thing there. So it's truly a global problem. And, anything you've heard about, if you don't live in New York State, you don't have to worry about it. That's not at all true either. It is, Lyme disease, if you look at the surveillance that the CDC does, for example, how many cases there are, the United States, the number of cases of Lyme disease ranks at number 3 as the 3rd most common bacterial infectious disease in this country. And anywhere from 30 to 50% of those people develop chronic illness as a result of that infection. And yet, there's very little funding for research. There's even, we're still fighting over medical guidelines. So all those things still remain. And I think that if we are able to change it, other countries will follow suit. They're all just sort of waiting to see how it plays out.
I would just add to that the model of Lyme disease care was invented in the United States and exported abroad. They're all following the Infectious Diseases Society of America rule book as upheld by the American government, as exported on the basis of the prestige of American medicine, which is undeserved. And that's the problem in a nutshell in terms of the international way in which Lyme disease is treated.
Can I add something? Actually, because I grew up in China, and we actually don't have that many cases reported in China. That doesn't mean we don't have many cases, because we generally we live in a city, urban place, so not many people exposed to woods or forests in China. So those people who contract Lyme disease, most of farmers, they even, got very sick. They have no idea they already got Lyme disease. The thing I want to end is, it's very interesting. When I got this disease and it became chronically, I got many dismissal here. Infection disease doctor insisted I don't have Lyme disease because my tests were negative, and they don't believe the concept of chronic Lyme disease. But I feel like it's quite interesting when I talk my situation, my condition with my family members, with my friends who live in China. They actually can very easily to accept and understand this situation. My father was a doctor, and he specialized in both traditional Chinese medicine and Western medicine. And before I told him, my condition, I was kind of worried about, if I got dismissed again, like what I encountered here. But when I talk about my condition with my father, he actually can, understand this situation quite easily. I think I feel like the American doctor, Western, doctors, and the Chinese doctors, they're kind of, they hold 2 different philosophies toward, these Lyme disease issues. Here, if you go to see a doctor and you said you tell the doctor, I'm not feeling well, the doctor would run lots of tests. If those tests were, are negative, and they might contribute your illness to psychological issues, right? But in China, especially those doctors who specialize in traditional Chinese medicine, if you meet them and say I'm not feeling well, and even they cannot figure out through the test, they still consider you're out of balance. So they treat you as a patient and try to fix you in a more holistic way. But here the situation is completely different.
I'm always the journalist, so can you tell us if Lyme disease is treated more effectively in China by virtue of that, what you described?
Actually, I can't say that because we don't have many cases. For the hospital, those doctors actually follows the American guidelines to treat Lyme disease. So like 2 weeks antibiotics or 3 weeks antibiotics. But I think Asian people become more cautious, with these issues. Every people feel like this issue is so scary, so they just, do more action to treat the patients. That's what I observed. Yeah.
This issue of kind of treating the patient as a whole person kind of brings me back to your photographs, Jiatong. And while the photographs don't necessarily make visible the disease and the physical condition of the disease, although I think in some cases they do, for me, they make very tangible the human experience of living with this condition, the emotional reality especially, and they kind of make visible something else that's very hard to make, something else that's quite invisible, which is trauma, something we've been talking a lot about. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on photography itself as kind of your primary medium, although anyone who sees the show will see this is not just a show of photographs, but how you think about the role of photography in all of this, in this project, its limitations.
Before we talk about the limitation, I want to say I feel like when I started this project and I realized the most existing work about Lyme disease either was like articles or documentary films. They are very wonderful media to explain this whole thing. But I feel like when people chose to watch a film or maybe read a book, they may already have some interest in this topic. Photography works kind of different way. For example, when people encounter an image, he doesn't need come to the image with intention or knowledge. The viewer always responds the image first, and also I feel like a photography can invite viewers get into the work through feelings, not only through information. So that side, I feel like photography can reach audience beyond the Lyme community. For example, I got lots of feedback, not only from Lyme patients, Lyme community. I got feedback from students who told me they actually can deeply resonate with my project, even they don't have Lyme disease, but they have other issues, right? And also I got feedback from healthcare providers and educators, and they said this project helped them to better understand the experiences of living with chronic Lyme disease. But for the limitation, yeah, I do feel there's limitation. It's for especially for invisible illness. To be honest, based on my own experiences, I feel capture invisible illness through photography is not an easy thing. Yeah, I try my best to visualize my subject's internal state through the photography, but when you talk about the illness, it's really hard to capture. I used to make a photo. It's my self-portrait, and I didn't photograph myself directly because I look just normal. So I want to visualize the pain inside my body. So at that same time, I realized, photography also can provide spaces for kind of abstraction and imagination. So I just use that space. I use the wrapped barbed wire like a shape around my body, and I photographed it on a bed sheet. So it becomes a metaphor for the suffering inside my body. For that work, it did. I believe it worked really well, but for some moment it's still very, hard to translate the feeling, the illness, into a visual format. So I also, you can see from the installation, I also included some other medium to, describe the patient's feelings, the pain, and also the emotional feelings. Yeah.
So I want to open things up to questions, if there are any, from our audience. We don't have an audience mic, so if you would just speak up, anyone who does want to ask a question or make a comment to our panelists, we would welcome that. Yeah, please.
So just a very pragmatic question, perhaps also for the doctor. If we're sitting in this world of uncertainty, when the tests don't tell you anything, and you go into the doctor and you don't feel well, like your daughter just came home from school, and I feel bad, how do you keep from getting onto this longer journey? Is there anything to improve your odds of correctly identifying what the problem is and therefore avoiding?
Holly, great question on all of our minds.
That's really a very great question. And the answer is not yet, but there will be. And, the need for a way to discriminate who has Lyme and who doesn't have Lyme so that you can initiate that treatment and then maybe ameliorate some of these issues is a recognized need. And from the top to the bottom. All right. So, and that's something that you can put research funds toward. That's things that you can work on. And there are other teams working on this. We're not the only ones that are doing it. There are other teams that are doing it as well. And then I think the landscape changes significantly when it becomes very clear that Lyme disease is a huge, significant issue. And then perhaps it's like, oh, maybe we really do need to look into this further and spend more time doing all that. So, I'm going to throw it into the lap of diagnostic testing for that. But in terms of everything else, I'm just, unfortunately, I didn't know until it was too late. And I'm sure, Jiatong, you didn't know until it was too late that my daughter had Lyme disease. So at that point, all I could do was advocate. Once I found out what it was, we found doctors that would be willing to treat this bacterial infection with an antibiotic, right? So be brave and stand up and advocate for yourself. You can believe the internet, some of it, most of it maybe, especially with Lyme disease, where Lyme disease is concerned, just to, make it happen. And it can happen that way.
So my question has to do with, we're talking about the Lyme disease. What about attacking the problem, the actual ticks? Are you aware of anything that's going on that's attacking that?
I mean, yeah, this is maybe where climate change comes in as well, right?
Yes, climate change is certainly part of what is driving the ticks to go further north, to go up mountains. I actually found studies for my book showing that they were this far up the mountain, and 20 years later, they were that far up the mountain where it was colder. Yeah, we do have, tell me your question again about.
Well, basically, I want to know if anything that you're aware of that's being done to attack
Yes.
the actual ticks.
We've had actual studies in Dutchess County. Ken, you might know the details better, and Holly, in which they have studied the populations of ticks and used various approaches to try and control them. And they haven't done very well because, ticks don't honor borders on property. They move around. Mice bring them everywhere. Birds are bringing them further north. That's kind of a reason why they're, but no, we haven't made much progress on that. I'll let Holly talk.
And I just want to point out that study, so what they did was treat suburban areas, yards, with 3 different approaches, right? So one was a fungus that eats ticks. The other was a chemical agent. Actually, 2 of them were chemical agents, 2 different chemical agents. And what they found was the tick populations went down, and yet it did not at all impact the rate of Lyme disease with those people. So what does that mean? That's the hard part. So in other words, we could we could get rid of a lot of ticks. The reality is maternal fetal transmission is another route of transmission. In places where they don't have ticks, they have Lyme disease. So everybody focuses on ticks because it's an easy target, or we think it's an easy target, we can get at it, but ticks are really good at what they do as well. So I don't know that is ever going to be successful, because let's face it, right? Malaria, we're going to get rid of malaria because what we're going to do, we're going to kill all the mosquitoes. Excuse me, how did that work out? So it's a very complex biological issue, and you can't really ever remove that. The other one I always hear is, let's kill all the deer. Okay, that doesn't work either. The deer are the poor schmucks like us. They're they just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The ticks get on them. It's not going to change the ability of those ticks to, reproduce. It's the mice, honestly, that does most of the problem. But
Okay, at this point, someone's going to say, but what about a vaccine?
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, and those have problems as well. The first vaccine that came out, Lymerix, actually harmed a lot of people, didn't work very well, had to be taken 2 and 3 times to reach its effectiveness. There's another one in the works right now, but I would say we're going to have similar problems as well. One of them being that a single tick bite can deliver a number of different pathogens, not just Lyme disease. So how do you deal with all of that? There's an idea for a tick vaccine that will actually kill the tick when it bites you or make the tick fall off. You will be inoculated with something that responds to the saliva of the tick. In the perfect world, that would be kind of good. You just dispatch the whole problem in one fell swoop. We're a long way, though, from that becoming a reality.
I was wondering if there's any overlap or partnerships with like the American Veterinary Medical Association and the Archival Veterinary field, as well as having tick-borne things going on. And I find them generally to be very full of advocacy and understanding and medical background to really understand it. There's a lot of things we can do for our pets and our dogs and things like that. We don't seem to be quite there even on the awareness level. I just didn't know if that's something that you work on in legislature or in science.
yeah, so right now there's an initiative, it's been an ongoing initiative called One Health. Are you familiar with that? One Health is, we're animals too. So we can learn from what veterinarians have and vice versa, right? So, and for the record, the vaccine that your dog can get for Lyme disease is the former vaccine that Mary Beth just mentioned, just for the record. So one thing I've noticed with veterinarians is if the dog comes in and it has symptoms, they will address the symptoms. So in other words, they don't worry about the antibiotic, whether or not it's like the police are going to come and arrest me because I gave this dog more than 5 days of antibiotics, right? Veterinarians are more proactive in that regard. There are a lot of rules and regulations on the medical side that makes that harder to do. But the One Health initiative, I think, is awesome because what you're finding out in the animal side can translate to help guide the human side too. So.
Thank you guys, first of all, for having this discussion. We're kind of in the middle of our own Lyme battle right now, so it's just very validating. And more of a pragmatic question, I'm curious if you guys are aware of any resources where we might be able to find a doctor that is vetted and, esteemed in this mental health. Just another Google, but maybe just to show shortcut and not have to go see 50 million doctors? Maybe is there a resource we could find someone who can help?
Or I'm thinking, Jiatong, of the kind of communities of patients who become kind of their own resource for finding treatment. You know, this is a doctor who listened. This is someone, this is a practice where I did find treatment, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I feel I don't know how to answer this question because the situation is very complicated. You know, different people respond differently, not only to the disease but also to the treatment. If this treatment works for you, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean the treatment works for me. So it's very complicated from my perspective. Yeah.
And I can just say that there are resources available through advocacy organizations, and the three that I would put out right away: Global Lyme Alliance, the Project Lyme, both are in New York State, and then another one is Bay Area Lyme, and also LymeDisease.org. They all have websites, and they have excellent information. They also have they help you find providers nearby that get the bigger part of the problem. And if you wanted to talk to me later, I'd be more than happy to share some information with you about that.
I get asked that question a lot as a journalist, and it's there's too few doctors who are really schooled in Lyme disease, and that's the problem. So I don't know where to send them. But these days, based on what I've learned since writing about Lyme disease, I went into COVID. I told you I'm not mainstream anymore. I would say try alternative medicine. Try ways to support your immune system, naturopaths, and people who are kind of on the outside, off the grid, who will try other things to help you, because it's really difficult to get the Lyme disease practitioner who's going to solve your problem, because, as Jiatong said, everybody's got a different response to it, and you know, who knows what's going to work.
Yeah, all the way in the back.
So did everybody hear that question? So the question of whether or not the bacteria that cause Lyme disease can be sexually transmitted, in my opinion, has not been fully answered. So there's some research out there suggesting that it could be, right? They found the bacteria in breast milk. They've found the bacteria in secretions, but there truly is no real strong evidence that it is being transmitted that way. You know, bacteria, well, and actually all microbial agents have their preferred routes. So obviously the preferred route for this organism is tick-borne, right? So that's the preferred route. However, because these bacteria spread throughout the whole body and get into other tissues, there's potential for other routes of transmission, like the maternal fetal transmission. That does occur. But I don't feel confident enough to say that sexual transmission is one of those routes at least not at this time.
Yeah, one more right here.
Is there any political reason behind the lack of funding for Lyme disease?
Wait, how much time do we have?
Yeah, so that'll probably be our last question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, starting in the 1990s, Lyme became highly politicized. And it's still, there's potential reasons why, but the reality is two camps evolved. One camp is the hardcore, it's a bacterial infection, you treat it with antibiotics, it goes away, hardly anybody gets it, no big deal. Then there's the other side. And I have to say that there's become a huge divide there. I mean, literally, that the title of that article was the Lyme Wars. There are wars between patients who have been harmed as a result of this and then went back and tried to attack those guidelines from government people, one of whom Mary Beth mentioned, the Lyme Looney guy. And those wars created a whole lot of separation between the two sides. And that still exists today. So there's a whole bunch of us in the middle who are trying to say, look, you were right about that, you were right about that. How about we get together and solve this together? But the reality is, because, for example, the CDC, NIH, a lot of the leaders of these particular areas, the focus areas, are infectious disease specialists. The messaging that comes from the government tends to be on the side that Lyme is hard to catch and easy to cure. So, and then there's a whole loud voice on the other side saying it needs to get better. And I have to say, it's resolved. It's getting resolved. National Academy of Sciences has convened 3 different meetings looking at what we're calling infection-associated chronic illness, because Lyme isn't the only one, right? COVID, we learned this with COVID. And I think that really opened a few eyes to the fact that, whoa, these infectious diseases can actually lead to long-term complications that may or may not have anything to do with the continuing presence of the organism. To this moment, it's unknown whether COVID sticks around in the body or does not. I mean, that's not true. It is known that it does, but what the impact of that is. So, there are still many issues to be resolved, but the reality is until funding goes up, and that's something that advocates have been pushing for a lot and have successfully increased funding from 5 million a year to over 100 million a year. But compare that to the funding for a disease like tuberculosis at $2 billion a year funding research. And just for the record, there were less than 10,000 cases of tuberculosis in the United States last year, compared to 400 and almost 500,000 cases of Lyme disease. And yet both cause chronic illnesses. One is just more popular than the other. So just got to keep on working at it and just letting people know that there truly is a need for more research on this particular topic. HIV, those folks, they did a great job, right? They did a great job. Why can't we do that?
Well, I think as bleak as Lyme can be, as something to talk about and study and experience, what I'm really appreciating and thinking about throughout this conversation is how important it is that it is being tackled from all of these different perspectives, right? From advocacy, science, journalism, someone who's willing to step outside of mainstream journalism to talk about this, and of course, art as an avenue for getting to this in a totally different way, and making something visible that desperately needs to be more visible. So I'm really grateful for this conversation. I think we're going to leave it here because I want to allow a little bit of time in case anyone wants to see the exhibition. You have the artist here to walk you through in a very informal way. So anyone who wants to do that can meet Jiatong over in the gallery. And thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.